For this week, we're going to be looking more in depth at the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. So to begin, we're going to start by looking at the Spanish colonies in the Americas. So initially, it looks like the Spanish are going to take second place to the Portuguese as far as exploration. However, impressive colonies in places like Peru and Mexico would emerge to prove otherwise. People like the Mexica and Inca were used to a centralized authority as well as a forced labor or tribute system. However, the Spanish would use this to their advantage and turn these systems upside down. Centered in Mexico City and Lima, the Spanish Empire was able to adjust pre-existing empires to their particular customs and needs. New systems of empire were based more on collaboration, however, than simple forced authority. The Spanish were able to reach agreements with local rulers regarding tribute payments and labor needs. Native rulers cooperated to protect their communities from excessive exploitation and to defend their traditional way of life. There was also an encomienda system that emerged. The way this worked was that encomiendas were permitted to their holders and descendants so that they could collect tribute. Many people who had encomiendas were lower lords or people in Spain who might not have been the richest, but they also were pretty well off. The tribute that they collected came from a region of native villages. They could collect their tribute through coin or through forced labor. By the 1540s, there were approximately 600 encomiendas in New Spain and 500 in Peru, living off the production and tribute of their Indians. When we think about this encomienda system, one good example is in Peru with the mines that they create. For example, I'll show you a picture real quick. You have Potosi, this mountain right here. There's a lot of silver there. So what happens is that people who have encomiendas in this part of what will be Peru, what they're going to do is they exploit the natives and force them to give up their labor 1 year in every 7 years. And when they do that, they are going to basically be forced to work in these mines in very, very bad conditions. It's so bad, in fact, that some mothers will even try to maim their children so that they don't have to go work in these mines because there's a very, very high chance that they would not actually return, or if they did, they would be hurt even worse. So this is a very, very harsh forced labor system. The encomienda system served the purpose of extending Spanish power across the land and supervising much of the settled population of native peoples. However, most of the encomiendas, as I've mentioned previously, had to be negotiated arrangements with local native chiefs. For example, Cortez's encomienda towns had the same nobles and lords as in the Mexica times. They took responsibility for the production and gathering of tribute goods and left the task of organizing the required labor services to their more localized mayors. The crown also began to restrict and regulate the encomienda system. In 1542, you can see the passage of the New Laws. The new laws prohibited the enslavement of Indians for any reason in the future. They also essentially abolished the encomienda system by prohibiting new awards or new encomiendas being produced, and terminating to the monarchy upon the death of their holders' current encomiendas. However, the policy was not enforced, particularly in New Spain. The Spanish Catholic Church also played a large role in spreading Spanish rule. The royal government was not the only bureaucracy established by Spain. The Spanish Catholic Church was as much a part of the structure of imperial authority in America as the state was. The structure of dioceses and parishes, as well as the system of provinces of the regular or monastic church, provided a clerical bureaucracy as extensive and influential as that of the royal government. In several papal edicts in the late 15th and early 16th century, the Pope essentially gave the Spanish monarchy control of the American church. As a result, the church and state in America were virtually one. Missionaries were part of religious orders, mainly of Franciscans and Dominicans. They spread across the Americas and attached themselves to communities of natives. They learned native languages, studied native history, culture, and religion. They also built churches and monasteries on the sites of native temples, founded schools, and helped to get native nobility baptized as well as converted to Catholicism. In this way, you can see that they work towards conversion, but also in spreading into towns where natives are, they are going to continue to spread Catholic as well as Spanish influence. In order to better understand the Spanish in the Americas, let's look at a particular city. So for this, we are going to be looking at Lima. Lima is a very good example of a Spanish-American city. First of all, it is laid out in a rational grid system. This rational grid system is something that emerged and was inspired by the Renaissance thinking on how to better plan towns. At the center of the city, there was a public square where people would meet to discuss different ideas, but also in order to trade. In addition to that, we can see that this area was going to be governed by the Cabildo, or city council, which was composed of 12 councilors who took specific posts such as inspector of weights and measures, director of public ceremonies, inspector of public works, and so on. With these positions, people were able to hold a lot of power, and they worked on having laws to really help govern the Spanish in Lima. In addition to that, we can see that this area is going to be very multi-ethnic. So for example, not only are you going to have a lot of Catholic Spanish who are going to come to this area, but you are also going to have some people who are of Jewish descent who end up coming to Lima in order to make money and also to escape any sort of persecution in Europe. In addition to that, we can also see that there were a lot of different races that were present in Lima. For example, by 1614, the population had grown to around 25,000 people. Africans comprised the largest single ethnic group with 10,386 Africans living in Lima at the time. In addition to that, you can see that there were many mulattoes, around 11,000, and that the Spanish only numbered around 9,616. There were also around 2,000 native Andeans and only 192 mestizos, or people of mixed Spanish and Indian offspring. The small number of mestizos suggests that many sons and daughters of mixed Indian and Spanish unions lived as Indian towns, or they passed as Spanish. In addition to that, in Lima, you can see that they had very large religious establishments. The Catholic Church was very big in Lima, and in addition to that, they were very well known at the time for their manufacturing and commerce. Natives tend to live in their own towns, and you began to see that the Spanish and the natives were separating themselves from each other within society. Again, the picture I have up here is of Potosi. This is going to be a mining region in what will later be Peru. And in this mining center, you can see a very good example of this system of tribute. They call this the Mita system, which we have already talked about before. We talked about this Mita system and how it existed in the Inca Empire and how they would be required to give a certain amount of labor every year or every few years in order to be part of the society. So the Spanish, again, they take advantage of systems that already exist, and you can see that here. The mining centers are going to be very extensive and become very, very wealthy by exploiting the natives. Again, this labor is very hard, and there is a lot of labor that is required. So many people are going to be killed working in these mines and in the process of making the Spanish Empire wealthy. We're going to shift gears and talk a little bit about the Portuguese and the colonies that they are going to set up in Africa. I'm not going to spend too much time on this particular section because we have already covered this topic. However, I think it's interesting that your book points out a little bit more about this Columbian exchange that we looked at last week, so you can sort of see connection from each of the weeks in order to see a more full and vivid picture of what's happening in the Atlantic. So the Portuguese are going to revolutionize agriculture in West Africa with the introduction of new fruits and crops from both the Indian Ocean and the Americas, again, part of this Columbian exchange. From Asia came things like oranges, bananas, and coconuts. The Americas contributed items like pineapples, papayas, guava, and sweet potatoes. Surprisingly, maize did not become a popular food for a long time, whereas cassava, or manioc from Brazil, became the most important staple of many people's diet. Another way we can better understand the Portuguese in Africa is by looking at Sao Tome. So Sao Tome's economy was first based on cattle ranching and the provisioning of ships. However, the introduction of sugar in the late 15th century transformed the island into a booming plantation colony. Portuguese merchants transplanted sugarcane and people skilled in sugar cultivation and milling from Madeira to Sao Tome. Between 1530 and 1550, the production of sugar more than doubled in Sao Tome. However, the sugar economy demanded slave labor, and therefore the merchants of Sao Tome entered the slave trade to protect their plantations and to ensure they had a steady supply of slaves to take care of their sugar production. However, Sao Tome is also going to give us our first instance of slave revolt and violence. The planters of Sao Tome were always plagued by slave revolts as well as attacks from free Africans and later even raids from French and Dutch pirates and privateers. A slave revolt beginning around 1544 produced a settlement of free Africans who were almost constantly at war with the Portuguese. These Angolares, as they were called, raided plantations and burned fields and mills, captured female slaves for marriage, and in 1574 attacked and largely destroyed the city of Sao Tome itself. This war continued until around 1693 when a Portuguese force invaded the homeland of the Angolares and destroyed their settlements and enslaved the survivors. But again, you can see that with these plantations that are emerging, you are going to have the development of slaves who are going to be able to resist this system. And that's something that we will see as a common theme throughout this course. Switch gears and look at the Portuguese in the New World. When we look at the Portuguese in the New World, Brazil gives a very good example of the emergence of a plantation complex. However, for the Portuguese, Brazil really did not have that much power and influence until much later. In the early 16th century, Brazil was mainly used for the trade of Brazil wood, and they sold different licenses to other traders to get that wood. However, you will eventually see that the Dutch are going to come in and take control of Portugal. So in the 1620s and 1640s, the Dutch rebel against the Spanish and their closest ally, the Portuguese. They attack Brazil and they take control. In doing so, they are able to set up some sugar plantations in Brazil. Now, the Brazil colony will eventually be retaken by the Portuguese. However, the impact of sugar will remain. So let's quickly go over what a plantation system is and what it looks like. So with a plantation system, you have to have three elements. The first element is going to be a cash crop. So for Brazil, this cash crop is going to be sugar. With a cash crop, this is a crop that you grow in a very large amount, and in growing this large amount, you are able to take it and sell it to other regions and to other people in order to make a profit. In addition to that, sugar, as well as most other cash crops, requires a very extensive labor force. So much so that most of the laborers are going to be forced laborers coming from Africa in the form of slaves. In addition to that, a plantation system also has to have transportation to get goods from one place to another. For the Portuguese, this transportation is mainly going to be undertaken by both Portuguese ships and by the Dutch, who continue to maintain trade relations with the Portuguese even once they lose control of the area. Sugar plantations in Brazil are going to be mainly self-sufficient. They raised cattle, horses, and sheep. They farmed corn, wheat, and forged iron tools, as well as making their own leather goods. Specialization in sugarcane produced a market for foodstuffs, which encouraged the creation of farms and ranches that fed plantations in the coastal towns. In addition, artisans and craftsmen immigrated to Brazil towns where their skills were found productive and they had a lot of employment. You can see with Brazil, unlike Africa and Asia, enticed many Portuguese to actually leave their homes. Brazil, unlike other colonies, were a place where you could see families also moving, as opposed to just men who were trying to make a quick dollar. So with Brazil, Portugal will quickly realize that it is going to be its wealthiest colony, and you are going to see that sugar is going to completely transform the area. In addition to that, it's important to think a little bit about the culture that emerges. There were many African men and women who were forced to come to Brazil. Because of the harshness of the environment, many slaves died before they were able to have children, and more Africans were steadily brought in. The culture that was created in Brazil is one where you started to see religion emerging. The religion that emerged among African slaves is one that we can see as a syncretic religion. This type of religion mixed elements of Catholicism as well as African religions. The religions that emerged were better able to deal with and understand the harsh nature of Brazil as well as the harsh treatment of slaves. In future videos and weeks, we will look more extensively at slave religion and how it adapted to the New World, how it also incorporated elements of Christianity as well as African traditions. So for this week, we have really looked at the Spanish and the Portuguese in the New World in a few ways. First, we began by looking at the encomienda system that emerged, as well as how the Spanish Catholic Church helped to spread the Spanish dominion across places in what would become Mexico and Peru. We also looked at Lima as an example of a Spanish-American city, as well as native towns and places like Potosi where native labor was exploited in this tribute system that emerged. Next, we moved ahead and looked at the Portuguese in Africa. We saw elements of the Columbian exchange, as well as how sugar plantations transformed places like São Tomé. We then looked at Brazil and finally looked at the emergence of a plantation system. The idea of a plantation system is something we will carry with us into the coming weeks. As always, have a great week, and if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know.